Hey there, A-Push friends. This is Nate Greve.
And this is Joshua Davis.
Today at our podcast, we'll be talking about how Vietnam changed American politics and society.
Good morning, Vietnam!
Obviously, we're going to be using a lot of our present-day knowledge in analyzing this. We're going to be breaking this podcast up into two parts, politics and society. And throughout the podcast, you'll be hearing some music from the Vietnam War.
Let's just jump into it. Vietnam greatly damaged the U.S. economy and cost us over $168 billion. And after a few years of the war, Americans were sick of it. And this began to affect how we viewed the president and how we were going to vote for our president. Nate, would you like to tell us more about that?
So in terms of politics, we had 5 different presidents during that time, and they each had their own perspective of the war. They took a part in developing the situation there, and it seemed like their presidency, the legacy of it, was directly impacted about what happened in Vietnam during that time. So it could either make or break their presidency. At the time, with the media, music, counterculture, students, and with the politicians, everyone seemed to have a very polarized perspective of the war. And this changed how American society thought about foreign intervention. And this was a drastic change from before the war, after World War II, and then after the Vietnam War, and became an issue in the wars to come. So the Vietnam War started with Dwight D. Eisenhower. He took office in 1953, and he held office till 1961. And in September of 1954, that was when he created the Southeast Treaty Organization, and that was his attempt to block the spread of communism to Southeast Asia. At the current time, Americans were afraid that if one small country fell to communism, then it would spread to the neighboring countries, including Laos, Cambodia, India, and basically take over the whole region and then eventually spread around the whole world. It was called the Domino Effect. The first time America got involved with the war in Vietnam was when Eisenhower sent American military advisors to Vietnam to help build Diem's army in 1955. And Diem announced the formation of the Republic of Vietnam, which was later known as South Vietnam. And the idea of that treaty was to offer military aid and economic assistance to the new nation, especially with a northern communist country. John F. Kennedy, in my opinion, was the best president in keeping the Americans against the communist spread. And because of him, that was why, at the very beginning, Americans probably supported the war the most. Kennedy pledged more aid and military advisors to help train the South Vietnamese army. And that took over like $65 million in military equipment, $136 million economic aid. And that was all by 1961. The war has only been going on for 6 years.
Johnson won the 1964 presidential election by a landslide. He sent the first combat troops into Vietnam in 1965. Johnson continuously expanded the number of U.S. troops he sent to Vietnam. At one point, this number got as high as 500,000 in 1968. Despite the increasing number of deaths, he continuously to send troops. This greatly lowered his approval ratings, and he didn't even seek a re-election because his approval ratings were so low, and he knew he was going to lose. And in 1968, Johnson formally announced that he'd be talking about peace treaties with Vietnam.
With Richard Nixon, he pulled out a lot of the United States troops as he saw that Vietnam was falling. The Pentagon Papers was a huge controversy at the time, along with the Watergate scandal. And because of that scandal, Nixon was elected for another 4 more years. But after the results of the Watergate scandal came out, the American media was more concerned with domestic issues than with international issues. And the support for the war definitely deteriorated over time.
Nixon even broadcasted campaign ads denouncing the war.
Never has so much military, economic, and diplomatic power been used so ineffectively as in Vietnam. If after all of this time and all of this sacrifice and all of this support, there is still no end in sight, then I say the time has come for the American people to turn to new leadership, not tied to the policies and mistakes of the past.
So Gerald Ford finished out Nixon's second term after he resigned from office, Gerald Ford definitely made that final plea to Congress to try to fix the Vietnam situation. He sought $722 million in military aid, and this was his last attempt to save the crumbling regime. However, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee declared that they would not give Vietnam any more military aid. However, they'll give them the necessary sums for evacuation.
This decision tangibly marks the change in Congress's attention from solving foreign issues to focusing on domestic issues.
It was on April 23rd, 1975, when Ford was finally able to declare that the Vietnam War, as far as America is concerned, was over. And 7 days later, on April 30th, 1975, Saigon was captured and the South Vietnam fell to the communists.
Probably the most prevalent impact of the Vietnam War is how it affected American society. The U.S. paid high costs for the Vietnam War. It was not a cheap war, and 1.6 million people who served in combat, and over 300,000 were physically wounded, and many more psychologically wounded.
The American spirit was high, as America was the victors of World War II, and America was very patriotic. So when we first went into the Vietnam War, the majority of America's intentions to keep communism at bay, and we really thought we would win the war. So as the war definitely went downhill, and the media was able to report on the horrors of war. The Vietnam War is also known as the first televised war, and this really crushed American spirit. And people began to question the validity of the war and what it was worth when they started seeing the body bags come back. This was the first time that Americans had to use the draft, and that sent a lot of people, willing or not, to go fight in a foreign country and supposedly for defending American freedom. So there was a lot of a conflict of interest there. And because of this, U.S. people started to question the military. They started to question their tactics. It came out in the news, all these atrocities Americans had committed against the citizens there in Vietnam. And these were terrible for America when they went over the news. It made America look very bad internationally. And when all these boys had to be sent to war, every citizen felt like they had a stake in this war. It wasn't just the men that had to go over there. Everyone knew someone that was having to fight. And this was prevalent when it came to music, hippie movement, and counterculture. And later on, student protests and riots. They didn't want American involvement anymore.
Like Nate was saying, the TV was a big impact on the Vietnam War. This was the first televised war, and it left many people thinking the war wasn't as triumphant as we had thought in the past. It was more real and in your living room. So this greatly affected how we viewed our presidents at the time, especially Lyndon B. Johnson, who had great backlash from this war. And as I said, he didn't even seek a re-election. Many people died in this war, and the veterans were very mistreated when they came back from war. Many people thought that maybe it was their fault we were in the war, but as we know from the Pentagon Papers, it was the effect of the government and their pride. The Pentagon Papers were papers that leaked from the government that told pretty much we knew we were going to lose the war and there was no reason to be in it.
Let's talk about the more long-term impacts of the war. We've been talking about the short-term impacts, what happened immediately after the war, but if we look at this from a more broader perspective, let's think about our military, the participation of the military. Back before the war, participation in military was super, super high. And this was because of increased patriotism. And men wanted to honor their families. They wanted to honor their country. They wanted to honor themselves. And when Vietnam War happened, and following that, and people were forced to go to war with the draft, this really decreased the military participation. If you look at our wars today, of course, we don't have a draft, and it's very, very rare that people participate in the military. Immediately after war, there was a high suicide rate. A lot of them fell to alcoholism. And those who've seen Forrest Gump, they know about Lieutenant Dan. He came back from the war, and he wanted to die. This really did represent how Americans, and especially American men, they wanted to follow in the footsteps of their fathers that participated in Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War I and World War II. And for Lieutenant Dan, all of his fathers had died in the war in glory. And Lieutenant Dan, he felt it was his destiny to die in the war. And when Forrest Gump had cheated him out of that, he fell into a life of depression, alcoholism. He was a heavy smoker, and it got to the point where he almost committed suicide.
Lieutenant Dan sure knew his stuff. I felt real lucky he was my lieutenant. He was from a long, great military tradition. Somebody in his family had fought and died in every single American war.
Leave me here! Get away! Just leave me here! Get out!
Big strong arm. How copy this? Over.
God, I said leave me here!
So that it kind of a neat story. That movie does represent the perspective of the men during that time. So an interesting phenomenon that occurred after the Vietnam War is called the Vietnam Syndrome. As Josh mentioned earlier, 58,000 men made the final sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifices, and then it also led to the spending of hundreds of billions of dollars to contain communism in this small, tiny country out in Asia. And after Vietnam, American leaders, and especially citizens, they were pressured by citizens because they definitely wanted to get reelected. They definitely considered entering other countries' problems. America wanted to stay more domestic in their issues, and we're really going back to the days with America's foundings, and George Washington never wanted America to get involved with foreign wars. There's something to be said for returning back to original American values where we only get involved with domestic affairs.
This war also left people not trusting our government, and Americans were kind of feeling betrayed a bit. They felt that they were lied to about what was going on in the war, and they felt the government was too quick to just send off more and more Americans to just die. And this just left a bad taste in our mouth.
I wouldn't limit it to just our presidents. We had a lot of members of Congress that seemed like they were personally invested in making sure that America won this war. And I think a good majority of the citizens really wanted to win the war. And, it started out with the younger people that decided that, what's the point? They didn't see the use in it, and they were tired of fighting it.
So this was our Vietnam podcast. I'm Joshua Davis.
And I'm Nick Greve.
And have a super day.
Yeah.